The C.S. Lewis Institute presents Questioning Belief with your host, Dr. Kathleen Noller. Welcome to the Questioning Belief podcast sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Noller, former atheist turned Christian and biomedical scientist. Please join me as we tackle common and nuanced objections to Christianity with the help of a topical expert. Our objection today concerns miracles. I've written two different flavors, if you will, of objections on the subject. First, that miracles are violations of the law of nature and are therefore impossible occurrences in a universe governed by those laws. Any recorded Christian miracles are either intentional fabrications or unintentionally deceptive results of the observer's incorrect perception of a non-miraculous event due to either physiologic dysfunction or groupthink.
A sentence or two from David Hume would correct what you said. A miracle is defined not as a part of the natural order, but as a suspension of the natural order.
An intervention.
You can't say of the Big Bang, which is the foundation of the natural order, that it's a suspension of what it starts. You may not do that. However, if you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake? And in each case you must, and especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did. But I would go further and say the following. I'll grant you that it would be possible to track the pregnancy of the woman Mary, who's mentioned about 3 times in the Bible, and to show that there was no male intervention in her life at all, but yet she delivered herself of a healthy baby boy. I can say, I don't say that's impossible. Parthenogenesis is not completely unthinkable, but it does not prove that his paternity is divine. And it wouldn't prove that any of his moral teachings were thereby correct. Nor, if I was to see him executed one day and see him walking the streets the next, would that show that his father was God, or his mother was a virgin, or that his teachings were true.
The second flavor is concerning the reasonableness of accepting evidence for a miracle. That even if a law of nature was capable of being overridden to produce a miracle, we would never have enough testimonial evidence to outweigh the plethora of evidence we have of the natural world conforming to the laws of nature. Thus, it would be more reasonable in every case to assume a miracle did not occur. So joining us today to tackle these objections is Dr. Timothy McGrew. He is professor in philosophy at Western Michigan University. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University and specializes in epistemology, the philosophy and history of science, probability theory, and the history and philosophy of religion. His most recent book is titled 4 Views on Christianity and Philosophy. Dr. McGrew authored the article on miracles for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and has spoken in universities, churches, seminaries, and engaged in many public debates on the meaning of faith, the rationality of belief in miracles, and the historical reliability of the Gospels. Welcome, Dr. McGrew.
Thank you so much, Kathleen.
Thank you for joining us. So I thought it would be helpful for our listeners if we lay down some definitions. So first, how do you define a miracle?
So this is a contentious point, and since you've asked me for my definition, I would say a simple definition of a miracle is an event that exceeds the productive power of the natural world broadly construed. So we, insofar as we are beings within the natural world, we have our powers as well, but it would exceed our powers as well as the powers of nature to produce, and would therefore excite wonder if someone were to recognize that it had occurred and were to know enough about the natural world to realize, hey, that nature can't do this by itself. So that would be a simple definition. It is one that is consistent with the definition offered by J.L. Mackie in his book, The Miracle of Theism. Mackie, very famously, was an atheist philosopher at Oxford. And in the very first chapter of his book, he tries to define a miracle and then runs through the most standard objection to belief in miracles. And this is the kind of definition that he settles on as well. So I feel comfortable saying that I'm not begging the question by adopting Mackey's definition.
Yeah, so you said there is a little bit of debate as to the definition of miracle in the philosophy community. What are some other definitions, and why have you not favored those?
So some definitions would include an event brought about by the particular action of a deity. And I have not chosen to go that route, even though, as in sort of a basis for an inference, the occurrence of a miracle would seem to provide evidence for the existence of a deity, because I want to be able to look at these things insofar as they can at first be physically determined on the factual side. Right? Here's a thing that occurred. Well, what were the causes of it? Let's have a discussion of that, but we need to separate the data from the inference insofar as we're able to do that. And so I would rather say, here is testimony of apparent eyewitnesses with nothing to gain and much to lose, saying that a man who has just been executed has come back to life and has had conversations and shared meals with them. And they are his intimate friends. It is unlikely that they are merely deceived. So these kinds of things, then we can make inferences as to, well, what could plausibly be the cause of this. But I don't want to build that into the definition proper. There are other skeptical definitions. David Hume very famously simply defined a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. Well, given Hume's own definition of what the laws of nature are, that comes around to something that didn't happen unless we're just wrong about what the laws of nature are.
Mm-hmm.
And so the didn't happen thing is obviously question begging vis-a-vis this discussion. And the unless we're wrong about the laws of nature just gives him an out. So he can say, we might have to accept the testimony, granting something with his right hand. But then we would just revise our view of the laws of nature, taking it back with the left. So he's kind of got a little bit of a game going there. And I don't want to fall into that trap because I think that renders it impossible for us to change our minds about these things if we are wrong. That's a bad position to be in rationally. Nobody really should voluntarily say, I want to go in through the trapdoor and never come out again, even if I am in fact wrong. I never want to know. That's very problematic, at least to my turn of mind. Your mileage may vary.
Yes, that makes sense why you would not want to do that. I am wondering if your definition of a miracle, you said it doesn't presuppose a deity, but does it presuppose the existence of a supernatural world? And how can we have conversations about miracles with materialists if these kinds of presuppositions differ so widely?
It does not presuppose the existence of an immaterial or non-natural world, but it does leave open the possibility.
Okay.
Look, the history of science is just littered with examples of things that were not presupposed going in, but which, in the form of the evidence we eventually acquired, we were compelled to believe in. Entities with fractional charges that can never be found singly, objects literally so dense that you can't see them. What are these? This is crazy. Things that scarcely interact at all, only in the weakest of possible ways. We've got, the Higgs boson and neutrinos. We don't come in saying of these things, they definitely exist. Now let's go look for evidence for them. Mm-hmm. And you could say, all right, the examples that you just gave are examples of things that are, after all, at least physical possibilities. So you haven't really taken us outside the physical world quite right. I grant that. But the wider point is that we can draw these categories in a variety of ways. I can say, with regard to a deity, angels, demons, what you will, well, if these things exist, then they are real, not material, but real. So can we at least leave open the possibility, again, just in the name of not foreclosing discussion on a matter of fact? This is the kind of thing where, in principle, it could be the case. I don't think arguments that God's existence is logically impossible are very plausible at all. I've never found those very convincing, and I think most people don't, unless they're deep in the grip of an ideology already. But the argument that it's implausible or that there's no evidence for it, we can have that discussion as long as we've established that we're not going to rule these things out a priori. There are a lot of things I don't believe in that I would not rule out a priori. Aliens flying drones over New Jersey. No, I don't. I don't believe there are aliens flying drones over New Jersey. Could I, in principle, be convinced of it? I think I could, in principle, be convinced of it. I'm not holding my breath, but if you've got the evidence, let's have a conversation.
Yes, that makes sense. And you mentioned before laws of nature and how
Mhm.
Hume refers to a violation of the laws of nature. So how do you
Mhm.
define the laws of nature, and does your definition differ from his definition?
Right. So I would define the laws of nature as those general regularities that tell us how the natural world, broadly considered, including ourselves, behaves when it is left to itself, when it is not interfered with from outside, when the system is, as we like to say in physics, a closed system. So the question of the causal closure of the natural world is just an extension of the very common notion in physics of the causal closure of some physical system. Frequently, we look at a physical system and we ask, is it insulated from external effects? Or at least insulated well enough that it's not going to mess with our margins of error. We can ask this question about the entire physical system as well. And however much one might believe initially that, yes, that's surely a closed system, that possibility that it is not a closed system is an open one. So I would define the laws of nature as telling us how nature behaves when it is left to itself without prejudging the question of whether it is always or usually left to itself. That's a separate question. There's some finessing to be done on the left to itself stuff if you're a theist. Happy to do that, right? I mean, there are always the people who say, but God's in control of everything. Nothing is left to itself. But I think we can make a distinction between general providence and special providence. I'm one of those people like Isaac Newton, like Robert Boyle, who believes that God set up a physical world and set up regularities and rules, and it follows along those regularities, those rules, unless it is interfered with. And this is one of the reasons why we can do so much toward understanding the natural world. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating study. You yourself, as a scientist, can't can't be immune to the charms of that, right? Wow, there's this amazing thing. Let's find out how it works. There was a good friend of Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle. Some of our listeners will remember Boyle's Law from a high school physical science class, who wrote a book called The Christian Virtuoso. And in it, he argued that Christians of all people ought to study science, and that the person in the best position to be able to say what would count as a miracle and what would not count as a miracle should be the Christian who's open to this evidence, who is a thoroughly informed scientist, who knows the scope and the limits of nature. Then you won't be inclined to take something that nature can itself do without any interference as a miracle, but you also won't be inclined to take something that nature cannot do by itself as a mundane event. And I think that Boyle was really sharp on that point, and I have no reason to abandon that point of view. I think that that's actually a very sound approach.
That is a very sound approach. That reminds me a little bit of I've seen several miracles that have been circulated within the Protestant apologetics community, one of which is a healing miracle, not to go off topic, but one of which is a healing miracle of a woman who had multiple sclerosis. And this woman was said to go off of the medication, to have prayed a lot, and then to have received healing and cessation of her symptoms. But the problem with that is if you are actually familiar with medicine, then it can be a relapsing remitting disorder and can go on and off by itself.
Right.
So it doesn't really beget the healing miracle, and it doesn't really fit the criteria. So I very much agree with Boyle there.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean it couldn't be. It
Yeah.
might be. There might even be attendant circumstances that would make us think, "Oh, wow, okay, that's a really remarkable coincidence between, say, a fervent petitionary prayer and a 1 week later X-ray showing there's nothing there." So, okay, interesting. But when we know that these things can come and can go, I think a lot of times when we take large numbers of people who are ill and then we try to sift through, oh, but maybe some of them got better. Well, probably some of them were on the upward path at just about that time anyway. And so it's a delicate matter to try to press that into service as evidence. Could be. I have heard some interesting cases that have some attendant details that I don't know how to sort out. But, you know, both directions, I sometimes reflect to myself that I might need to get out more. I might need both to talk to more of the people who are reporting these things and to talk to more of the scientists who are specialists in remission and just sort of get more perspectives. And that's fine. Nothing about being a devout Christian compels one to accept as genuine every miracle claim that has been advanced, any more than one has to reject all miracle claims or all miracle claims in a different religious tradition. If the world is not causally closed, then there may be more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies, with apologies to Hamlet.
Yes, that's a very good point. I'd like to touch back on the phrase when the natural world is left to itself. So you mentioned some Christians might have a few questions about that. Let's just go down that road for a second for our listeners
Sure.
who might be confused by that phrase and say, well, that is that a deistic God? And sort of see how that fits with the God of the Bible.
Sure. So I think that one can make a very strong case that God made creation with causal powers of its own. And of course, when you have an omnipotent being, everyone serves at his pleasure, right? If God gets completely fed up with the snail darters, then he can just take them out. It doesn't take any difficulty on his part. It's not like there's some challenge to his power. However, the evidence that I believe we have is that God has made a natural world with causal powers running in causally regular ways. And unless something from outside that natural world intervenes in it, again, I'm not defining that as God yet. Let's just wait and see on the empirical side. It will continue to work its way out according to those regularities. And I don't even think that definition treads on the toes of any particular interpretation of quantum mechanics. I didn't say it's a deterministic system. It, it might be, it might not be. There might be a distributive lattice underneath all of the things that we're unaware of. There might not be. If it is, it's certainly non-local, yada, yada. We can go on about the quantum mechanics stuff. But really, I'm not trying to sort of take a stance on that issue. I think that the definition I've given is neutral between them. God created nature. Nature's got certain ways it functions if it is not intervened with, interfered with. And this then permits us to do this investigation of nature, which on the whole, I think is not interfered with. And that's great.
Okay, so I think we've firmly established what we mean by miracle and what we mean by law of nature. The last definition I'd like to establish is that of either rational or reasonable, and also to discuss sort of what we're arguing for here. Are we aiming to state that it is rational to believe that a miracle could occur, or that it's reasonable to believe that a particular miracle did occur? And is there different phrasing that you would prefer?
So let me start with the vocabulary issue. The way that I am using these things, I would use rational and reasonable as broadly synonymous. I'm not trying to invest them with any super specialized meaning here. And the way that I would get at what I'm trying to say when I use either of those terms is in terms of evidence. Now, you invited me on this podcast, so you get my views on it. Not everybody will agree. Philosophers are a fractious bunch. We're not, three philosophers in the room, 5 or 6 opinions. So
Sure.
we're going to go with mine though, and that is that there are some things that you can know immediately, not by inference. If I know that I have a headache, it's not because I am staring in the mirror, I see my flushed face, my bloodshot eyes, the bottle of Tylenol clenched in my trembling hand. I'm aware of my headache in a more direct way than that. I don't have to infer it the way you would infer it, which might leave you wondering, yeah, but maybe Tim is just a spectacularly good actor and he's putting one over on me to avoid, going in today or something. But beyond the things that we can know immediately, all the things that we are justified in believing, including all the things that count as knowledge, can be traced back, I would say, inferentially to things that we can know without inference, things that we can know directly. Those are sometimes called foundations or basic beliefs. The inference relations do not have to be deductive, and I don't think they generally are. Deductive inference, like proof in mathematics, is reserved for very, very special kinds of connections between premises and conclusion. But there are other sorts of inference relations, inference to the best explanation, for example, which I would model using probability. But this is, I think, a widely used, but still maybe not adequately appreciated kind of inference. And I think that we use this a tremendous amount. And I would say that much of what we unquestionably accept can, in principle, be traced via those kinds of explanatory relations back to the things of which we are fundamentally certain or foundationally certain. Mm-hmm. So when I say someone is reasonable, what I mean is he's got good reasons of the kind that correspond to that. I don't necessarily mean he can articulate them all. We've all had the experience of being quite sure something is true, but not being sure exactly at the moment how we got there. And we worry a little bit whether we're being the subject of some kind of psychological trick, right? But sometimes we can trace it back. Do you have time for me to tell you a quick story on this?
Absolutely.
So not a miracle story. This is a story from a time when I taught out in Washington State, and I had gone across the Idaho Panhandle to Moscow, Idaho. There's a store I needed to go to. It was raining and dark and miserable outside, and the parking lot wasn't very full. I parked my car and got out of it, and in the direction opposite the direction of the store, there was a buzzing noise, and it could have been from a car that was a little distance out that way, or it could have been from a light post, which was considerably further away than that. I was not inclined to investigate. I turned my back on them both and went marching for the door of the store, and was immediately profoundly convinced that the noise was coming from the light post and not from the parked car. Now, my back is to both of them, and I'm moving away from them, and it was such an odd thing for me to be so certain of that I started introspecting, as a philosopher will do, even though I was no longer approaching them, looking at them. And here's what I realized. The sound was not dropping off very fast. Now, I had, in those few strides, more than doubled my distance from the car. That was the nearer object. And it should have dropped off quite a bit by my more than doubling the distance. But I hadn't even close to doubled my distance to the light post, which was a great deal further away. And so the noise just wasn't dropping off fast enough. And I was able to step aside and watch myself go by cognitively and catch myself there and realize I was responding to cues. But mercifully, we do almost all of this at a level that's below the level of conscious awareness. I mean, I really don't want you trying to process things out from first principles as you're exiting the freeway. At least if you do, I don't want my car anywhere near yours, and you don't want yours near mine if I'm doing that, right? But so a lot of this is handled without conscious effort, and it must be for good function. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have a structure. So I'm persuaded that quite a bit of what we do rationally could be attributed to what we might call subconscious inference. And that's not just a fuzzy thing. And I think that we can, in principle, get back to that. You know, I look out the window, I see trees and snow. Don't know how cold it is there. We're in the middle of a very cold snap right here in Michigan. But I look out there now. How can I see that not as trees and snow, but as patterns of color and light and shade? It might take some effort. Maybe I would have to work at, say, seeing things like an impressionist painter does. And yet, if I weren't aware of the colors, the shapes, the light, the shade, I wouldn't be aware of the trees and the snow. So I think, again, much of this happens subconsciously, but I am persuaded that there is such a thing as subconscious inference. And I think that's very important. Maybe we can circle back to that later, because people will ask, well, by your high standards, how can grandma ever be justified in believing in God? And I have things to say about grandma. I think grandma is shrewder than we think. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was my story. Go ahead.
No, I love the story. So let's go through a little bit of history of objections towards miracles. So in your Stanford Encyclopedia entry on miracles, you note that arguments against miracles generally fall into two categories: either those designed to show that miracles are impossible, or those designed to show that miracle claims could never be believable. So I'd like to go through the history of these claims, starting with the former. So I pulled out the objections of philosopher Baruch Spinoza from the 1600s, and he argues in three steps, and I'm hoping you can take us through these. First, the will of God is identical with the laws of nature. Second, a miracle is the violation of the laws of nature. Three, God's will is inviolable, so miracles can't happen. So, how do you respond to this type of argument saying that miracles contradict God's will as it relates to the natural world?
Right. So Spinoza, what an interesting case. This is from his Tractatus of 1670. Spinoza is, I think, fighting in the teeth of opposition to reorient the entire structure of religious language so that it can all be reinterpreted and accepted by someone who doesn't actually believe any of the traditional religious claims whatsoever, doesn't believe in the existence of God, doesn't believe in a world beyond nature. And he's not always interpreted that way, I'm well aware. But as I'm reading the Tractatus, I get the strong sense of somebody who wants to say, look, we're all trying to get to the same thing. It's just that you need to understand what you really mean by the laws of nature or by the will of God is just the laws of nature.
Mm.
And then to say, oh, the laws of nature are sometimes violated by God is to say that nature sometimes violates itself. That makes no sense. End of discussion. So that would be an impossibility argument.
Mm-hmm.
And the place that I would attack that first is just to say, who made up this definition of the will of God as being identical with the laws of nature?
Mm-hmm.
That is something that you can put forward as a attempt to explain why people say the things that they do about the will of God, but only after you have successfully argued that there is not, or very probably is not, a God at all. Then we reach for the sociological explanations of what people are doing. So you're no doubt familiar with C.S. Lewis's very famous essay, Bulverism,
Mm-hmm.
in which he says, hey, we have this tendency that we think that we have explained something if we say, oh, you just say that because. And I think this is closely related that Spinoza's doing this sort of high-handed redefinition of the terms. And honestly, it never caught on with anyone who was sincerely religious because I think everyone who thought about it for 4 or 5 seconds said, that's not what I mean by the will of God.
Yes.
That's just not, it's a kind of a non-starter of an argument for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I really think Spinoza sincerely thought there's a great deal of religious sentiment in the world. Spinoza, of course, found himself sort of between two worlds. He was Jewish, but was kicked out of synagogue. He had many Christian correspondents, but he wasn't interested in Christianity per se. But he saw all these people using all this language and thought, well, wouldn't it be great if I could sort of solve the problem by showing that somehow we had all been talking about the same thing all along? Yeah. Imagine how happy Richard Dawkins would be if Ayaan Hirsi Ali had simply said to him, Richard, I still don't believe in God in that sense. I just sort of think Christianity is a fabulous cultural idea. He'd have been much happier than he was when she said, no, I'm afraid I actually do believe it's true.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And I had a follow-up question to that. So a little bit different than Spinoza's argument, but what would you say to those who assert that miracles are evidence that God wasn't a good enough creator or didn't design the world well enough that he needed to step in and alter it?
Yeah, so I think the question that we have to ask is, what are we envisaging God as optimizing? So this is, in part, it's a question in speculative theology, and it's in part a question in optimization. If God is supposed from the outset to have been trying to set up a system that he would never interfere with, well, I suppose omnipotence can do this. But is that really something that we are entitled to say ab initio without going and looking at the evidence? We have only one sermon written by Isaac Newton. It's preserved in the library at Cambridge. And in that sermon, what Newton says very curiously is God delights to be worshipped chiefly not for who he is, but for what he has done. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And so I just reiterated over and over and over. And Newton had certainly read his Old Testament obsessively. And the point is that intervention in what is typically a system left to itself is the act of sovereignty. By what other means could God announce his presence? Spinoza says, by none whatsoever. Okay, what would you say of God? That he's the contemplative servant of the works of his own hands. He can no more interfere with nature, nay, less than the weakest of his creatures, right? I can mess around a little bit with the natural world. Here I am holding up a mug of coffee against the entire gravitational force of the planet, right? But God can't do anything like that. No. Well, why think a thing like that? Why think that he was trying to optimize it so that he literally couldn't announce his own presence? It's not for his sake. It's for ours that God has made a world that he can break into. And notably, the central Jewish and Christian claims are claims that he has done exactly that, not wholesale, but at what I think C.S. Lewis called the great ganglia of history, the places where all the threads draw together. There are these things that come in clusters. And this is God announcing his presence. Nicodemus seems to understand this in John's Gospel. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher sent from God, for no man can do the works you do unless God is with him. So it exceeds the power of any man to do these things. You must be a messenger sent from God. Well, you got the point. You might not yet have got the point of the point, but you're getting the point, right? So keep going, Nicodemus. I don't think that he is misfiring there. I think he's actually got his finger on something exactly right. And so when we say, oh, it's a mark of inadequacy, and inadequacy for what? If God wished to convey to us a message we desperately needed and wanted to do so in a way that reasonably, rationally, we would be inexcusable for writing off as merely some kind of fine human philosophy or some exceptionally subtle working of nature, how could he break through to us except by intervening in the causal order which otherwise reigns, which otherwise holds? It is at once the sort of the possibility of communication between God and man, and also, if I can borrow Tolkien's phrase, it's the opportunity for the greatest eucatastrophe, right? When things seem to be the worst possible, the night, the darkest. This is when you need that ray of light breaking through. And if it has to break through from outside the system, so much the greater the eucatastrophe.
Yes, absolutely. I love that quote as well. And what do you think of generally the sort of use of presuppositions about God's character to inform scientific knowledge or findings about the natural world? Here we see, somebody's made a presupposition that God as a designer would design a world so perfect or so well ordered that he wouldn't need to step in. I've seen other presuppositions. I forget who made this, but there was one scientist or theologian, maybe back in medieval times, who presupposed that God would not create something that had imperfection in it. So he argued that the moon didn't have craters on it, that the moon's surface would be smooth. Otherwise, it wouldn't fit with the idea of God as a designer. But then we have ideas too that are, very fair presuppositions, like God is a creator. And so we expect to see some elements of intelligent design in our universe. And so as a philosopher, how do you see presuppositions like that applied to the natural world?
I think the best way for us to approach those is to hold with an open hand a whole variety of things as logically possible. But I think that the best principles for us to proceed by are those that can first be approached and examined by evidence. So I don't want to march in with an inviolable presumption about anything. I am happy to come to conclusions. I just don't want to confuse them with premises. And if I think that my premises feel good to me, then to just sort of walk in and not subject them to any kind of testing, that seems to me to be the wrong attitude. And it seems to me that it's something that, from the cognitive psychology angle, we realize we are all prone to do. Christians are prone to do it. Religious people who are not Christian are prone to do it. Atheists are prone to do it. Agnostics are prone to do it. We all have this tendency to come in with a strongly held belief and just not see the evidence that might tell against it, right? So this confirmation bias, which is just sort of an active version, if you will, of the frequency illusion, where I just bought a Subaru and I see Subarus everywhere. Well, they were there already. They were all around me. I just wasn't paying attention, right? Well, now I have a strongly held belief and I see evidence for it everywhere. I don't see the evidence against it. That's a problem. It's everybody's problem. It's a difficulty, not a cause of despair. I think there are things we can do about it. But if somebody says, oh, God wouldn't do that, part of me just wants to say, exactly how are you so sure what God would or would not do? Maybe you've got some evidence for it, and if so, tell me that. And then let me see if I agree with you, coming to that as the conclusion of a line of argument. But this is a reason that I really want to insist on separating data from inference, again, to the extent that we can. I think that we want to have discussions where we found common ground. We can say, to the reasonable skeptic, look, there are very old texts which, on our best rational reconstruction, seem very clearly to be making these kinds of claims. We have some claims about who wrote them. We can make, some kind of arguments about when, but we have the text. There's a point for us to begin the discussion. And if they won't agree to that, but what's the old humorous song? We never walked on the moon, Elvis ain't dead. Sometimes people are just too far out there, and all you can say is, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee, right? There's no more conversation to be had. But if they're willing to at least make an effort to find the common ground where we can say, okay, this much we'll just agree that this is our data. Mm-hmm. And I might think that you should admit more to the set of data than you are, but at least we can start there. At least we can have a conversation. So assumptions like that can turn out to be supportable by data. They can turn out to be insupportable. No holidays from evidence. Not for me, not for thee. Let's just, let's walk in, sort it out, have the conversations. They will be better conversations if people are more intimately familiar with the evidence. Would love to talk about that sometime. But I think that we should have them in an evidence-based way, and we should ask people, look, what is your explanation for the things that we both agree are facts? And there should be give and take. Each person should have a chance to ask that of the other. It's not about having a one-sided yelling session, but I think good conversations can occur when, with goodwill, we sit down and we say, no, can we really sort this out? And I'm not saying that everyone will persuade everyone else. That is mathematically impossible. I'm not even saying that half of us will persuade the other half. That's just psychologically not going to happen. But it's the best way to start conversations. And eventually, sometimes only in hindsight, people come back to those conversations and they say, that might have been the beginning of my changing my mind about something. And that's beautiful. We can't always identify, but I think sometimes we can.
Each year, many of us will go through a physical checkup, a performance review at our workplace, perhaps do a financial checkup at year's end or at tax time. But how often do we take time to review our spiritual life? Those who are saved by grace are called to grow in grace, 2 Peter 3:18. As disciples of Jesus, we are to live a life of love for God and love for our neighbor in the power of the Holy Spirit. Too often in the busyness of our day-to-day lives, we let other priorities crowd out the two highest priorities Jesus gave us. The spiritual checkup questions are designed to help you examine your spiritual life over the past year and to prayerfully seek God's help in areas where you sense He desires you to grow in the new year. There are links after most of the questions, guiding you to resources that we pray will stir your hearts and minds toward that growth. You can find the spiritual checkup at cslewisinstitute.org/annual spiritual checkup. That's annual-spiritual-checkup. Yes, I think many people, especially non-believers, will very much appreciate that evidence-based approach as well. And especially those who are, I speak to a lot of folks who are scientists, but, you know, very much entrenched in scientism. And that's something that they can at least relate to. And we can sort of share the respective data on that side. This leads us to segue into the second argument on the believability of miracle claims. And so
Yeah.
this will be, I fear, the meat of our discussion on this historical response to miracles. David Hume's On Miracles, where he states that, quote, "When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then and not till then can he pretend to command my belief or opinion." So there are several proposed readings of Hume and of this passage. Can you take us through these and the key points and teach us how we should be reading Hume?
Yeah. The answer is, how much time did you say you had? I can start, but this is a big subject. So the big watershed in this is the answer one gives to the question, is Hume even trying to present an argument here?
Mhm.
So there is a line of thought, which I do not subscribe to, but it has its adherents, that says Hume isn't making an argument here. He's merely pointing out how high the bar is that you would have to clear in order to make it rational to believe in a miracle. And I suppose that there is a point to saying he just says, when anyone tells me, if the falsehood would be more miraculous. By the way, by more miraculous, he means less probable. That's just a little rhetorical flourish on his part. So when he says, I weigh the one miracle against the other, he means I weigh the respective improbabilities. He wants to come out on the side with the lesser improbability on its side. Now, it turns out we can give a mathematical reconstruction of that, but if we do, then the sort of the mathematical equation by itself won't settle the question of, well, where does the evidence lie? And in fact, some people, like Peter Bain, I believe, in responding to Hume, just said, great, do it. Let's do this. Does Hume do this? Oh, Hume doesn't actually do that. Hume doesn't engage with the evidence at all. He seems to have thought that by even leveling this challenge, he was just graveling the whole religious establishment, and that does not follow at all. So this is one of the reasons that George Campbell rather tartly says, if you think you're enlightened by this, you're welcome to it, but it doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. On one reading, it is just a tautology. Now, an argument can be, as we say, elliptical, which is to say that it can have unstated premises, and when you fill them in, then you get the full argument. So let's try to combine this with his statement that the argument against a miracle is in the nature of the case as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if the case against a miracle is maximally strong, and if we're weighing the case against it and the case for it, okay, then we know that weighing is always going to come out in favor of the case against it. And so it's never going to be rational for us to believe that a miracle has occurred. No matter what the evidence, it's never going to be rational. I really have a problem with saying something like that. It seems to me that if you're going to say that you can never be rational in believing something, then that thing had better be a logical or a mathematical contradiction. I'm good with that, right? If you say to me, there are square circles, I'm going to say, Euclidean? Are we talking, or, you say there are married bachelors. Are you using terms loosely to make some kind of a joke here, or do you literally mean bachelors? Because if you literally mean bachelors, then the answer is no, there just aren't. So the first thing that I want to do is just really ask a question. But If there are things that are within the realm of the logically possible, then I think it's a very, very bad idea to define ourselves into the impossibility of believing in them. That strikes me as something that we wouldn't do in ordinary life if it were put to us that bluntly. It's also the kind of thing that we would do in ordinary life without realizing it. I think one need only think of the profoundly fractured nature of political discourse in our country to realize you could get people in the room who would have a great difficulty in agreeing on things that each of them thought were the most obvious facts in the world,
Yes.
much less on the interpretations of those facts. And so, yeah, we do sometimes lock ourselves in these epistemic trapdoor scenarios, or lobster pots, as I've seen them described, where you can get in, just can't get out again. I really worry about that. I worry about that when I see Christians doing it. I worry about it when I see non-Christians doing it. Again, this is not a problem that one side's got a corner on. This is something that we see around us quite a bit, and I think we really need to say, hey, don't do that. Don't lock yourself off like that. Even if you are not holding your breath, you're not, you see a book on the paperback exchange shelf that says Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, and you're like, no, I don't believe it. And I don't either, right? But you also should not absolutely say, no matter what evidence they brought to me, I would never believe that. I would just refuse. Well, I mean, I suppose they could bring evidence, but again, like not holding my breath. But keep that little edge of openness to it, because this is a high stakes issue. This is not some kind of wrangle over the p-value in some set of experiments that somebody was trying to do and whether they really got a p-value this low or something. I thought that might be interesting to a couple of specialists, but this is of high stakes to everybody, right? Here we're looking at this and we're saying, okay, the fate of your immortal soul, if you have an immortal soul, could be hanging in the balance here. And so if it seems to you that this is not just wildly crazy, then it's time to be in earnest and not to shut yourself off from reasonable discussion if you can find people who seem reasonable to discuss it with you. So this question of miracles, since I take it that miracles and prophecy are the primary kinds of evidence Christians have appealed to throughout history, is a question that really can't be evaded. And to the extent that we're bringing assumptions to the discussion that could make it difficult or impossible for us to have reasonable discussions of these things, we need to stop that on both sides. Does that make sense?
Yes. Would you go so far as to say that it's irrational to refuse to change your belief despite being encountered by a significant amount of evidence?
It can be. It's going to depend on how much evidence you had for your original belief. So there is a lot of nonsense surrounding the phrase extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I do think sometimes it's simply being used as an excuse to not look at whatever it is that you've got. But at the same time, I want to be completely fair. If somebody comes to me and says that his uncle had a clean cancer scan, I'm going to say that's great. That's awesome. If he comes to me and he says his uncle rose from the dead, I'm going to say, tell me more. I need, before I accept this. So mundane events require less evidence than claims of supernatural intervention, partly because I think supernatural intervention is quite rare and should be if it's designed as a sign, if it's designed to get our attention. It shouldn't be the kind of thing that we can show off and say, yeah, turning water into wine, but there are Sherpas up in the Himalayas who can do that too. So, small percentages, but he was probably just one of those guys. No, actually, nobody can do that. That's not a thing that we can just write off as a rare but wholly natural sort of event we're already familiar with. So, anyway, don't mean to belabor that, but I really do think that the key point is that people should come to these discussions saying, I have certain views. I even have a certain amount of evidence for the views that I have. If you can, however, provide me with enough evidence, and I know that I need to be listening to the little bits of evidence, because very frequently the way that we learn we're wrong is not that there's one spectacular result that just turns everything on its head, but it's that there are a lot of little clues that are pointing towards something we don't believe. And then there are two dangers. One is that we won't notice the clues at all because they're little. No one of them compels a change in view. The other danger is that we'll notice them and immediately contemptuously dismiss them because they're small. But just like little vectors can add up into a big vector if enough of them are pointing in the same direction, so little pieces of evidence can mount up, and can mount up quite spectacularly, actually. And that's something that I work on in my life as a probability theory guy, but we won't take your listeners there unless you want us to, but it's an important point that even small pieces of evidence that all converge in a common center, so to speak, may draw us in a direction we never expected to go by their cumulative force. And no one of them has to be spectacular. No one of them has to be amazing in order for them to mount up to a very strong cumulative case.
Yes, and I think it goes back to your earlier point that the stakes are very high, and so it may not be worth your time investigating the evidences behind, for example, your uncle's clean cancer scan, but it would be very well worth your time investigating the evidences behind a miraculous claim that, if it were true, would mean that that uncle was a spiritual being or a god, or something was crazy was happening that would alter your worldview.
Oh boy, you guys just said that we can investigate all kinds of supernatural claims. All right, where do you begin? I bet you want to begin with your favorite one, don't you? But how about all the other ones? Because it's a natural enough question, and I think it deserves a rational answer. And so, even if it's posed as a gotcha, I think that it would behoove us to look at it soberly and to see what can be done. Because I will tell you, just from my point of view, and again, I speak here for no one but myself, I approach the Jewish and the Christian scriptures initially as someone with historical curiosity. And it is just not true from a historical point of view that every aspect of them, every story related, even every miracle story related, has an equal amount of evidence behind it. That doesn't mean that I'm saying, oh, then, the ones that don't have as much evidence must be false, because they do interlock to a certain extent. But man, if I wanted to investigate one claim and it's like this is the make or break, I would not choose Elisha and the floating axe head. That's just not where I would start. So we do need, I think, some criteria, not for settling the question, well, then that was nonsense, but for answering the more subtle question. If I really wanted to look into this in view of the plethora of claims that there are out there, where should I begin? How should I be approaching various miracle claims in order not to get lost in the great forest of claims? If some of them are more plausible and some less so, if there are reasons at least to wonder about some of them, how can I get my hands on those so that I don't end up just disappearing into the details and never being heard from again?
Yes, let's start with those criteria. And I think our listeners would love to hear both positive criteria to not determine if a miracle definitively has occurred, but to perhaps increase our confidence or likelihood that it's occurred, and then also the negative criteria that we can use to filter out those massive amount of miracle claims that are across time, culture, different religions that we all know are out there.
For the positive side, the place I would like to go first would be to somebody we don't much read these days, but his name is Charles Leslie. And he gives a criteriological argument, and I think we can reconstruct it in a way that's even better than the way Leslie himself puts it. But basically, he says, you may safely believe a historical claim if it meets 4 criteria: that the matters of fact attested in that be such as men's outward senses, their eyes and their ears, may be judges of it, that it be done publicly in the face of the world, that not only public monuments be kept up in memory of it, but some outward actions to be performed, and that such monuments and such actions or observances be instituted and commenced from the time that the matter of fact was done. So what Leslie is trying to do here is he's trying to rule out 2 different kinds of criticism. One is, that was just something that fooled people at the time that the claim was put forward. But really, it was such a thing that they could have been easily fooled. And he says, not if it's done publicly, not if it's the kind of thing that the senses can get a grip on. The other 2 are designed to assure us that it's not something that was claimed merely long after the fact. So if I said to you, hey, Kathleen, what's your family doing for Stupendous Day? And you look at me like, for what? And a Stupendous Day, right? I mean, it's been a national holiday for hundreds of years. Surely your family celebrates Stupendous Day. And you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, Tim. Okay, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to put one over on you by inventing a fake holiday and pretending that we've all known about it all along. And of course, we can't. There's no record that there was any such thing observed at the time to which I'm, referring, and for centuries afterward. In fact, right up until now, when I just made it up. So it would be very hard for me to convince you that Stupendous Day has always been celebrated. So Leslie's criteria give us a way of distinguishing things that have characteristics that make it hard to write them off either as impositions at the time or as fabrications much later.
Okay.
And so take the death of Christ, just as a very simple example. We have record of the Christians celebrating the Lord's Supper from right in the 1st century. Mm-hmm. It goes back to our first documentation of these things. Take the resurrection. Now, here's a funny thing. At the beginning in Jerusalem, the first Christians were almost exclusively devout Jews. And yet, in the letters of Paul, in the revelation of St. John, you find clear references not only to Sunday or the first day of the week as the day when they are congregating for worship, but also to the calling of that the Lord's Day. Mm-hmm. What could be the explanation for their doing that? Leslie says this is a historical celebration dating from the event said to have occurred that, he doesn't put it quite this way, but I would say it can be best explained and perhaps only satisfactorily explained by something spectacular happening that would make devout Jews say, we might go to synagogue on Sabbath, but we're meeting among ourselves on the Lord's Day. Mm. That's just tremendously important. Why is that tremendously important to them? Clearly it is. So that's the kind of memorial that I think Leslie has in view. So that's on the positive side. And there's a whole sort of history of discussion of this argument, which is quite fascinating. I do some of this in my Stanford Encyclopedia article. But on the negative side, I really like a book by John Douglas called The Criterion, where he is trying to offer criteria for distinguishing between miracles or miracle claims, I should say, which there is significant reason to doubt, even if they're true, there's a reason to doubt, and those that don't afford us those reasons for doubt. So Douglas puts forward 3 criteria. And if a miracle claim fails on any of these criteria, then there's a reason to doubt it. The first one is it first announced at the time that it's said to have occurred, or only much, much later? So a distance in time. Well, the Roman historian Tacitus, in his Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, talks about Christianity as having arisen from the death of the leader of the Christians, and the superstition, thus checked for a moment, sort of flared up again and spread all the way from Jerusalem even to Rome. So here you've got clearly a hostile witness. He thinks this is some kind of crackpot superstition, but he's testifying at the time. So he's talking about the memory of people in Rome then, because he's going to go on to talk about Nero's fixing the guilt for the burning of the slums and part of the non-slums in Rome onto the Christians. And he says there's a great deal of sympathy for them because it seemed that the tortures inflicted upon them were not for any guilt of theirs, but just to glut one man's cruelty. Mm-hmm. You need to remember, he was a young student in Rome in the 70s of the first century, so within a decade of those very events about which he's writing. And when he talks to us about the origins of Christianity, there's no reason to believe that he's relying on Christian sources. So there's that time thing. Second criterion, we want to know, was the first proclamation of this made in the location, the place where these kinds of things were alleged to have taken place? Or were they far, far away in a distant country where, travel is hard and we hear rumors, we can't go check on them? And so travel around the rim of the Mediterranean and the Roman world was very well known. People did it all the time. Josephus says 3 million people a year came to Jerusalem for the Passover. If he's exaggerating and it was only an order of magnitude less, just 300,000 people a year, that's a lot of people. That's a really big influx of people. And so what we're looking at is a world where travel may have been hard by the standards we're accustomed to, but people did it all the time. Ships going back and forth across the Mediterranean. Time of year made a big difference, but if it was a good time of year, you went to the festival. If you're close enough, you'd do the overland route. If you're not, you'd go to Caesarea Maritima and get off there and then come across into Jerusalem. But this is not too difficult to do. So that's fine. But like if we said something happened in the Indian subcontinent, now that would be comparatively much less accessible. Mm-hmm. That kind of travel wasn't being done there. So that's the second criterion that Douglas uses. The third one, though, is maybe the most important of all. And that is, would it have been allowed to pass the claim of a miracle without investigation? Because of, say, his social context in which it took place. Well, it was sort of falling in line with the predispositions of a large number of people. Because if it would, then the fact that people said it in the place and at the time doesn't carry as much weight for us if they would have been disinclined to give it sort of a raised eyebrow and a bit of a critical investigation. And so here, again, the resurrection just stands out. This is a claim that was made in the place within 50 days of the execution of the leader of the nascent Christian movement by the cooperation of both the religious and the civil authorities. Mm-hmm. It's not going to fly to say, oh, yeah, well, some of the people would have loved them for saying he rose from the dead, and other people would have said, hold it, I'm a bit skeptical of you now. No, that wasn't what it was at all. It was a much more radical environment than that. So those three criteria provide us a filter. And what Douglas says is, look, if you're looking for a place to start, if you want to know where the most plausible miracle claims are, look for things that pass those three criteria first, then we can talk. And it turns out that a whole bunch of these claims don't pass those criteria. That includes some of the Judeo-Christian miracle claims. That doesn't mean they didn't happen. It does mean they are not promising places to start the investigation. Mm-hmm. Sure. And so that, I think, is Douglas's brilliant, beautiful contribution to this discussion, is to say, look, really, we should be looking for the ones that at least pass these three. And then we can talk. And that doesn't mean that they're true if they do pass it, doesn't mean they're false if they don't, but it helps us to sort the more plausible places to begin from the less, which means it's not impossible to approach this question in a topic-neutral way. You'll notice none of the criteria, not the criterion of time or place or a hostile context, is directed toward the content of any particular religious tradition or any particular religious claim. These are topic-neutral criteria. And that's very much what we want. We don't want something that says, well, do you believe in the rainbow body theory of the Buddhist monks? Why are you asking me that? Present me with some evidence. Let's talk. No, I need to know whether you believe it first. Well, this is not topic neutral and it's not helping. So that's one of the reasons I think Douglas is so important and deserves to be better known. He wrote during Hume's lifetime. So Hume was still alive at the time. Hume didn't die until 1776. So Douglas and William Adams and George Campbell, John Leland, all wrote during Hume's own lifetime and very ably interacted with him. And I think that what they gave us was gold. I wish more people in the apologetics world would pay attention to what we have there, because sometimes these older writers just approach things in a very rational fashion.
Do you have any idea how many miracles have passed both those negative criteria and the positive criteria?
Very few. I once asked this question in front of a mixed audience of Christians and atheists in a debate, which you can find online, down in Texas. I hadn't really intended to do a debate, but I told my friend Ezra, I'll do anything you guys need me to do. And before I knew it, I was lined up to do debates. Okay, here we are. But somebody in the Q&A afterwards said he had a Hindu miracle claim that met all of these criteria. And I said, that's great. Don't run away afterwards. I want that. I want to get that. So I tracked him down afterwards. Took me a little bit of effort, but I did find him. And I said, so what's the source? He said, well, I read it in a book. I said, do you remember the title of the book? Well, no, he didn't remember the title. I said, what can you tell me about the book? Maybe I can find it. Well, it was a children's book that my Hindu parents gave me. Well, bummer, right? I was really looking forward to investigating it, and I would have, but that was it. That was all he gave me. Oh, in a children's book, it's, so we're not looking for someone to claim that something meets these. We're looking to see whether we've got credible evidence that something does pass these filters at the outset. And at that point, then we could roll up our sleeves and get digging. We're not merely looking for someone to claim that they passed them. And so, different conversations will go different ways. Some people will come to a discussion of Christianity with an attitude towards the New Testament so skeptical that they'll really be resistant to even taking seriously the idea that these claims were made when the witnesses were still alive. Surely not. It's the surely that causes me to lift an eyebrow. I think sometimes there's sort of an unspoken idea that if they had been made at the time when the witnesses were still alive, that would be good evidence, and we can't have that now, can we? So, yeah, one learns to sense the nuances in some of these objections, but the conversations might continue anyway.
Yes, absolutely. And it's so important to continue those conversations, continue the relationship. And I think another misunderstanding too that I hear a lot is related to the negative criterion that you want to rule out a miracle if an opinion has been already established. And that a lot of folks think that it's really common for world religions to be founded on evidence of a miracle. And so I think a lot of folks in the West see Mormonism and Christianity and think that must be extrapolated into other religions. Is that true? And are there other world religions that you know of that were founded on the evidence of a miracle?
No, actually, it's very rare for a new religion to be founded on a miracle claim. Certainly Islam was not. In fact, very famously in the Quran, Muhammad says, you're not going to get a miracle. You've had miracles for the other religions of the book already. That's all you're going to get. Shrewd move if you don't have it to give them. Now, you talk to a devout Muslim today, and there's a certain amount of retconning of this, and they'll tell you, the Quran itself is a miracle. Well, why is it a miracle, right? Well, it's just so majestic and so amazing. Be more specific. Tell me why.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can't tell that unless you can read Arabic, which most of them don't read well enough to be able to do this anyway. But you can understand why this is beginning to turn disappointing, right? There's also a scene in the Quran where Muhammad splits the moon in half, and then the halves come together. But the splitting of the moon occurs in a sequence which is clearly identified as a dream. And so by Leslie's criteria that it must be something done openly in the face of the world, men's outward senses can be the judges of it. Nope, not happening. Yeah. So it is actually very easy to support a false miracle claim with the help of an established religion. But it's quite difficult to promote a new and manufactured religion by the help of a faulty miracle claim. Something quite interesting from the history of Great Britain, and I don't know if many people know that this happened just before Hume's birth. So very early 1700s, there was a group of self-styled prophets that came over from France, the Camisards they were called. And at one point, they proclaimed that a certain leader of theirs who had died was going to rise from the dead on a stated day the next spring. Dr. Thomas Ems would be raised from the dead, dress himself in his accustomed manner, and deliver a homily. Well, a mob showed up with pitchforks, and they were rowdy, and they were like waiting for Thomas Ems to rise from the dead. I regret to inform you, Thomas Ems did not rise from the dead. There were all kinds of excuses that were made for this. But it's, there are cases where people have tried to be specific in a hostile context. It doesn't go over very well. So it's not the case that, anybody could do that and get away with it, right? I mean, and the more hostile the context, the better. If you wanted to start a religion of your own, you're going to travel along the path trod by L. Ron Hubbard, and you're going to make up your own Scientology. You're even a scientist. Maybe you can get away with this. And I offered to buy you a one-way ticket to a place for you to try to persuade people of your new religion. I will pay your transportation to Minneapolis, or I will pay your transportation to Mecca. Which one are you going to pick? Minneapolis, you might have success, you might not have success. And try to go to Mecca, you'll be dead before you hit baggage claim. You're not allowed in there. The hostile context makes an enormous difference to how receptive people are going to be to anything new. And that's why it's so important that we keep our eye on that. And when people bring up claims, here's a miracle story, here's a miracle story, we apply Douglas's filters and we ask ourselves, is this a plausible place to start, or is there some prima facie reason to be worried already? Again, that's not ruling out the possibility. It might be true anyway, but it's not a great place to start if right up front there's a red flag or two.
How are you growing in your faith? One way to grow in your faith is to take one or more study courses. We have a great diversity of courses in a range of apologetics, discipleship, the life and works of C.S. Lewis, families, and mentoring. You can find classes that are short, 1 or 2 sessions long to 9 months, or a year-long class. In addition, we also now offer a number of small live online classes where you will meet with other participants and a facilitator via Zoom and learn together. For more information, please go to cslewisinstitute.org/study courses sign up. That's study-courses sign up. So we've talked about a lot of physical miracles, and there are a lot of physical miracles in Catholic Church as well, levitation, healing. What about visions that don't subvert any laws of nature but are nonetheless remarkable? Can we even call those miracles?
I don't have a one-size-fits-all story to sell you on this. I think if this content of the alleged visions contradicts things that we have excellent reason to believe are true, that we have well-grounded in their own right, then I think that is, in the nature of the case, good reason to reject the visions as coming from any veridical source. But visions don't have to come from God. If I believe in a natural world that is not causally closed, it doesn't mean that everything outside of it is truth and goodness and beauty and would not deceive me. So I have a richer concept of what that can entail than simply, if it's a vision, real vision must have come from God. Maybe not. That doesn't seem to me to be obvious at all. So I am a naturally somewhat skeptical kind of person. And my first response to a claim like that is to quirk an eyebrow and to say, I'm going to have to hear a good deal more. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I need to take some of my own medicine. I don't want to be so implacably closed to the possibility that I couldn't be persuaded if there were actually really good evidence. But in the nature of the case, I worry that if someone says, I had a private vision, and it doesn't tie down in any respect to anything that can be checked, right? I mean, that's hard. If somebody has a vision and tells me the details of some as yet future and highly contingent event, and then he's borne out, I might be very interested. And if they can do this again and again, I might be rocked. Right? That is a kind of evidence that could, in principle, be very profound epistemically. But if they're simply saying, Chinese fortune cookie time, something wonderful is about to happen, your life will change. Everybody's life is changing, right? Cynic Tim comes in and says, wait, stop. What are we doing here? This is not sounding like an authoritative word from a source that I must acknowledge. If there's really a God who's the creator of the universe and is good and loving and gave his son to die for me, then I need to pay absolute attention to what he's saying. This one, not so clear. I like what Thomas Chalmers says about this. He says, when someone brings me a message from my sovereign, I am not entitled to sit in judgment of my sovereign. I am, however, absolutely entitled and indeed required to sit in judgment on the criteria that it is in fact a message from my sovereign. Mm-hmm. And I think that hits exactly the right note. My door is always open for truth, but I happen to know that quite a few imposters come through. And so I don't just let anybody wander in without stopping and checking their affidavits. I need to know if a supposed prophetic word or message actually comes from a source that I should be accepting. And if I can't authenticate it, then I think we ought to believe better of the goodness of God than that he would demand of us to receive things which we had done our best to test and could not. I mean, Paul himself says, test everything, hold on tightly to what is good. Yes. And the test everything part is a very important part of that.
Yes, that's a very important piece of it. And so on that note, let's test some of the Catholic miracles together and discuss some of these. This is something that I hear a lot in apologetic contexts. I'm a Protestant, and so I get asked a lot why I don't believe in the Catholic miracles. And the ones that I most often get asked about are the Eucharistic miracles and the healing miracles at Lourdes in France. For those who don't know, the transubstantiation Catholic teachings hold that the bread and the wine that's blessed by priest during Mass transform into the body and blood of Jesus. So the Eucharistic miracles, oftentimes a priest will, it's a very similar story. A priest will find a host, which is the blessed piece of bread, on the ground after Mass. And so per procedure, they'll place it into a container of water, place it in a safe, and then they'll come to open the safe later. They have a very specific procedure to I don't know if they dispose of these, but to handle them after they've been blessed. And then in some of these occasions, they found a red substance on the host. And so one of these from a church in Poland in 2008 has records that they left it to dry. They took it to pathologists at the medical university to take a look at it. They did histology under it. So they looked at it under the microscope and stained it to look for tissue. And they allegedly found something that appeared to be a cardiac tissue or skeletal muscle tissue interwoven with the bread. So the interwovenness, they said, meant that it wasn't tampered with. It wasn't just added after the fact. And so I've tried to look at these evidences. And I won't say anything yet. I will just see what you think about things like this and sort of how you handle these as a fellow Protestant.
We have reports facially from credentialed pathologists saying that there is cardiac muscle tissue interwoven with the matter of the bread in the sample that was brought, right? So the first thing to do would be to look and see if in fact we have those things, but for the sake of the argument, I'm going to accept that we do, right? Now, classic Catholic teaching about transubstantiation is actually contradicted by that. Transubstantiation is something that takes place according to traditional Catholic teaching to the substance of the Eucharist, but not to its accidents, not to its surface properties, which are the properties that we can investigate. Mm-hmm. It becomes in substance the body and blood of Christ, but in its accidental properties, it remains indistinguishable from bread and wine. So that actually contradicts Catholic teaching, and that would be a red flag immediately. That would be a worry. Second, what reason do we have to believe that this is not bread of some kind, wafer? I don't know whether they make it with or without leaven, but whichever way they do it, was baked with a little bit of blood or cardiac tissue. I mean, these things are not impossible to find, right? So again, I know that's like a horrible thing to say. What are you saying? It would seem as though someone likely committed fraud in that case. And I certainly don't want to spin around and point at someone random and say, Nat, and you are the one who committed fraud. But I don't think that we're in a strong position to go beyond that and say, no, this was in defiance of, 18, 17 centuries of Roman Catholic teaching about the Eucharist. This was something that actually ended up being a little bit bloody and fleshy. Wow, really? I'm sorry. Again, data on the one side, inferences from data on the other. If the cardiac tissue is really found in the pathologist report to be there, not to be skin tissue, not to be some other muscle tissue, let's read the report. But if the report says that, and if we accept the report, it's done credibly, the person had nothing to lose in doing it, we're still left saying, okay, how did it get there? And that's just very puzzling. So anyway, that would be my initial take on it. I don't want to be utterly unpersuadable, but sometimes the circumstances under which a claim is advanced do not do us any favors in the attempt to examine its affidavits.
The second Catholic miracle that has been widely discussed, even has its own article on PubMed, which is an NIH repository of journal articles, is the set of medical cures at Lourdes in France, following a 14-year-old girl having visions of the Virgin Mary at that site. And then from the 1850s to the 1900s, people have since flocked there to experience miracles. And I looked in one article, it said until 1976, there were a total of 1,200 cures since 1858 during that time.
Out of how many people visiting?
I don't know how many people visited. I don't know that they have that data. I would be interested to know of the folks who were not cured as well, and how many there were. But the article concludes that, quote, although uncommon, the miraculous cures are evidence of somatic and mental processes we do not know. So it didn't really conclude anything other than perhaps setting its stake on miraculous cures by using that phrase, but then the following piece about somatic and mental processes isn't terribly supportive of their identification as a miracle. So what are your
Right.
thoughts on those medical cures?
So let's go back to Bernadette, who was the oldest daughter of a miller in Lourdes, and came um, came forward with a story that she had met a lady who had asked that, I think it's a chapel, be built of her. Okay, so you got one child reporting an encounter that nobody else has in a devout Catholic context, where there's no hostile context, and she's saying that she met a lady, and now, by itself, honestly, would any of us recognize the Virgin Mary if she were to appear to us today, as opposed to any other broadly Middle Eastern appearing woman, in unfamiliar garb, speaking Koine Greek or Aramaic? No, is the answer. No, we wouldn't. There is an old story which is just passed on in passing, that among his other accomplishments, St. Luke was a painter, and that he once painted a portrait of Mary, which is a lovely story, but I can't confirm it, and I don't have the portrait, and so I couldn't compare it anyway, and so what am I going to do? So by itself, that's not a place that's very promising to be investigating it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Healings said to have taken place at a particular spot. Again, when there is a strong positive religious community and a strong feeling associated with it, then we need to calibrate our expectations with something from history. So, again, just around the years just before Hume was born, there was a factional dispute among different Catholics in Paris. And so the Jesuits and the Jansenists, and they were at each other's throats. Well, a much beloved Jansenist abbey died, and the Abbey Paris was buried in a tomb. And my word, the miracles that cropped up there, or were said to have cropped up there, and were promoted by the Jansenists. So you had blind people receiving their sight. You had people in the dozens falling down of convulsions, and then having other people witness their convulsions. And so there's lots of things going on there. Hume had heard about it through the work of somebody named Montgeron, who had written an account of it. But Montgeron's a true believer. He clearly accepted that all these things happened. When you've got a strong religious community that's not much invested in skeptically considering the truth of anything, and it's an established community, it's not just a brand new one, that you tend to get claims that it's kind of hard to follow up on, because in the nature of the case, they're circulating in what is not a hostile context. Yes, it's true that there were some Jesuit abbots and archbishops who took a look at these things and tried to publish an ordonnance saying, we found that some of the affidavits of the people were actually changed, and some of the people confessed that they had just made it up and stuff like that. So there's some of that went on in this particular thing in Paris. And beyond that, then, what if I had gone curious, not persuaded, not unpersuaded, and then had found a physical ailment of mine suddenly doing much better? Might have been a miraculous cure, might have been a natural recovery curve, might have been a fairly uncommon thing that I couldn't find a physician who could tell me about, but that is still natural in sort of the mechanism of its behavior. Any of those things could have happened. I have no doubt that some people who went to Lourdes suffering from ailments actually felt better. But then again, I have days when I'm suffering from ailments and I get up the next day and I feel better. I'm going to need more data than what I have seen to be persuaded that there are miraculous healings going on here, and the miraculous healings are taking place because of a supernatural force that is working at this location. And it could be, right? I can't rule out the possibility. I wouldn't want to. I don't want to be in the position of failing to take my own medicine and saying, oh, I could not be persuaded no matter what. No, I think I could, but I haven't seen the evidence for it. And the lack of a true hostile context does worry me a lot. I feel like we're failing on one of the key criteria that Douglas puts forward. And so I just, for that reason alone, my little skeptic meter is beeping gently in the background, and I'm just saying, and I'm sorry. It's not that I wouldn't want to believe it if it were true, but I'm just not finding it credible. And similarly for the bilocational miracles of Padre Pio or whatever other things people have brought up, I haven't found credible evidence of them, nor of some of the stories outside of the New Testament about the adventures of the apostles. Some of those seem to me to be so late and so far from the context in which we would have liked to have them examined that I'm not sure that we should put much, if any, weight on them.
I think that's very fair. And I think for those who want to explore other miracles, perhaps I haven't mentioned a miracle you're interested in if you're listening in. Hopefully you can apply those positive and negative criteria to help you rule out some false positives and consider and hone in your consideration on events that could be miraculous according to the positive criteria. But before we close, I'd like to discuss something a little bit more practical. And so there are a lot of Christians today who are praying for a miracle for some reason or another, perhaps to reach some end which they believe is good and biblical, but yet God hasn't granted it. And sometimes these miracles can just seem so obviously good, like the salvation of someone, even though perhaps that's not a miracle, or the physical salvation of somebody who's very, very ill and they're praying for healing for an infant, things like that. And that shakes their faith, even though they're Christians. And so, what would you say to them if they pray for a miracle and God hasn't granted it?
So, this question is the hardest of all that you've asked, because it's not really for Tim the philosopher or Tim the apologist. This is a pastoral question. Sometimes it's not the right time to try to give an answer to someone who is suffering. I want to say that first, and I want to say it clearly so that no one gets the idea that as a philosopher and somebody who's likes all the rational stuff, I advocate whipping out your New Testament and hitting them with certain key verses and sort of, maybe just shut up and weep with those who weep for a while. I do think it is worth our remembering, not necessarily always of our jumping to say these things first, but our remembering that Paul prayed for the removal of an affliction of his own and was told no. And that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane that the cup would pass from him. And it did not. So, David prayed that the child born to Bathsheba would not die on his account. Didn't get what he prayed for. So through Scripture, Old Testament and New, there is this thread running that petitionary prayer is not like inserting coins into a vending machine, or these days, a credit card, where you put the appropriate thing and you push the right buttons and then the thing you want comes out. There's a wonderful country western song that says some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. I really like that song, and I've had to live that to some extent over the past 4 years because my wife's health was severely damaged in April of 2021. And we have prayed. We have prayed for healing, natural or supernatural. And we live with this every day. And God has said no. And I don't have some handy answer to give to you or to anyone who is suffering to say, oh, well, this is the reason, right? Job's comforters are full of these answers. They've got them. And I, every time I read that story, I pause where my favorite line is just after the philosopher who's clearly giving us the first draft of his book on the problem of pain comes the voice, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Oh,
Very
ouch.
damning.
Right. Like, I should maybe have shut up quite a bit earlier here. And so, as speaking as someone, who has suffered, I can say that there are some things that we are not allowed to do. And despairing is one of them, and blaming God is another. But I wonder sometimes what it would be like to catch just that little glimpse out of the corner of one's mental eye, corner of the mind's eye, of the vision of all the ripple effects. This goes back to something I said earlier about optimization. What is God really doing with our suffering?
Mm-hmm.
What has He made me into that I wouldn't be made into if my wife weren't suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Is it an opportunity? Whether I take it well or not is a separate question, but for me to become more compassionate, is it a chance for me to be more ready to suffer with those who are suffering and less likely to spit out some kind of philosophical argument? Because if it hasn't, that's probably been a gain. Who is the only person who can comfort a woman who's had a miscarriage? If anybody can do it, it's the woman who can come alongside her and say, I know, I have a little pair of shoes in my top dresser drawer too. Sometimes there's a wonderful line from the British novelist Graham Greene in his novel Brighton Rock, a very dark novel on the whole. But at one point, a priest is speaking to one of the other characters. He said, you cannot begin to understand, my son, nor can I, nor can any of us, the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think all now mysterious shall be bright at last, but it's something that right now we have to hold on to the evidence that we have in the hope that we'll understand these things better. So just speaking as somebody who is walking through a little corner of that valley right now, and I don't think that it makes any sense for us to try to compare our sufferings to other people's sufferings. If we did, you could always find people who are clearly in some sense suffering a great deal more than I and mine. But even the little bit of it that we've experienced, God remains good and has remained good in that He's still given us useful things to do. And this is what we do then. And we trust Him because we have reason to trust Him. But trust is necessary when we don't have sight, right? Faith is trust. That's that word. Faith comes from the Greek word that literally means trust.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't trust when you see, you trust when you don't see, and you're risking or venturing something on that. And so we trust and we wait. So that's maybe a lot less than some people might hope I would have to say to somebody who's suffering like this, but it's the only honest answer I can give.
The best answer is the honest answer. And, I've also personally grappled with these issues, especially with my daughter when she was very, very young, was very, very ill in the
I'm so
ICU for
sorry.
a long time. Thank you. And it's just so difficult unless you view it in the context of eternity. And that doesn't make it easier. It doesn't
No.
make it less painful. It doesn't mean the suffering's not there. But there is that hope when, before I was a Christian, I didn't have that. There's no hope for the young person who dies. If you don't have the context of eternity, He's so much greater than us, and that sounds so cliche, but there's just some answers that we're just never going to know. But thank you so much for your answer to that question. Really, that was a very touching answer, and Thank you so much for your time, for joining us. And I'm going to close with a quote from C.S. Lewis's Miracles. In all these miracles alike, the incarnate God does suddenly and locally something that God has done or will do in general. Each miracle writes for us in small letters something that God has already written or will write in letters almost too large to be noticed across the whole canvas of nature. They focus at a particular point, either God's actual or his future operations on the universe. So thank you very much for listening. And thank you so much, Dr. McGrew, for your time and for joining us.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.